or two. Just we'll figure it out. Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, returning guest. If you listen to my show in the past, he's been on a couple times. This will be a third episode. His name is Jeremy Kuzmarov. Last name is spelled Kuzmarov. In our last shows, we talked about one was about an article he had written for CoverrtAction Mag, which is based on this article. If you're watching this on my three YouTube channels, X, Rumble, and Substack, you'll see the title of the article we're going to discuss, among other topics, but this will be the primary thing we look into is Timothy Leary, 1960s acid guru, may have been among the CIA's greatest assets. It was just published April 2026. So I'll put a link to the article. But our other episodes were, did J. Edgar Hoover order the assassination of MLK? And we also covered one of his books, which is titled Warmonger, how Clinton's malign foreign policy launched the U.S. trajectory from Bush to Biden. But he's also written 6 books on foreign policy. He has one that's coming out in a couple months, hopefully. The full title of that is Political Assassinations in America, the Intricate Nexus of Deep State Crimes. So check that out and keep that on your radar. But this article just kind of popped out to me because I've done a lot of research on Leary myself. So there was some stuff in there I wasn't aware of. And he's also cited a lot of people that I actually interviewed recently. Alfred McCoy was on my show fairly recently this year in 2026. And some of the other greats, McGowan. He also cites Jan Urban, who I know did a lot of research into WAS and things like that. But there's a lot about Leary. Leary had a remarkable trajectory in a lot of ways. And still his influence, I think, still reverberates, even through his people who he knows and things like that. So I think it's an important topic to cover. So I'm glad to have Jeremy back. So Jeremy Kuzmarov, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, it's great to be with you.
For people who hadn't heard our earlier 2 interviews or not aware of you and your work, maybe you could just talk a little bit, add to your background, and then we could talk about what led up to the publication of this article about Timothy Leary.
Okay, well, actually, I did a PhD degree at Brandeis University. My thesis was focused on the war on drugs because I had a background in criminology. So I was studying the war on drugs and also, the connection between the war on drugs and the Vietnam War. And that was published as my first book with the University of Massachusetts called The Myth of the Addicted Army, Vietnam and the Modern War on Drugs. And it went into the use of drugs in Vietnam and how the media created a false drug panic of returning soldiers. And actually, a very small percentage of soldiers who used drugs in the Vietnam War actually used back in the United States. And it actually validated a lot of that, some of the theories of Leary and some of his students about the, environmental, the social origin of drug use and environmental roots of it. And a kind of, I guess you can call, revisionist approach to drug, that they were less physically addictive, that it often had to do with individual psychology or social circumstance that people might be driven to take drugs, like in a bad environment like the Vietnam War. And that's how I got to learn about Leary, because I was reading a lot of the books about drug use in the 60s and different theories about drugs. And that was, the 60s was a period of a more liberal attitude. And a lot of researchers actually picked up on some of Leary's ideas. I mean, I think, although ultimately, and we can get into it, I have a negative assessment of Leary and his impact, but I think there were a lot of interesting things about him. And he had some, I think, very progressive ideas as a psychiatrist, working as a psychologist, because he was part of the anti-psychiatry movement that sought to democratize the profession. And he kind of looked at social condition that led people to exude behavior that was classified as mentally ill. But he was arguing that, well, society is so warped, and he referred to, I think, society as a giant insane asylum. And yeah, he felt that he was against the authoritarianism of the profession and a kind of condescending attitude. and advocated for democratization of the entire profession, and to have more sympathy and not to look at people who exhibited symptoms of mental illness as pathological in the kind of society we live in. And he kind of applied some of those ideas to drugs, and that it was a coping mechanism, at least in some of his earlier research. And he developed the concept of set and setting, that with the environment. Of course, he came to develop a more positive view of drug than LSD, that could be this conscious expanding drug, and that it was often the setting and environment in which people took drugs that shaped their reaction to the drug. So yes, there were some who had negative reaction, but it was because of their state before they took the drug, and the environment in which they took it. If it was a more positive environment, they could have very positive experiences with drugs. And he did an experiment in a prison where he sought to create a very relaxed atmosphere with music and yoga, and then administered LSD and claimed that they had a very positive effect on people. And some other drug researchers picked up on some of those ideas and actually did corroborate, did kind of approve of his idea of set and setting, that the media demonization, and that was the era he had Harry Anslinger was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, promoting the reefer madness, and that story that people would smoke a joint and then kill people or go crazy, and then they were jumping off building after they took LSD. But these researchers, feeding off Leary, took this view that actually, the media created this demonology that was fueling, oppressive drug policies, and that drugs could potentially have a positive effect. And it was also the environment that shaped people's, wanting to take drugs, and their experiences with drugs. And some applied that to Vietnam. That there were relatively high usage rates in Vietnam because it was such a bad environment in the war, and a lot of the soldiers hated being in Vietnam. They were draftees. It was the army, the oppressive institution. The war was horrible. They were getting killed, and the threat of death. They took drugs, a coping mechanism. And some found, like these are army psychiatrists, found that soldiers' experiences with drugs, and then the media was promoting all these lurid stories about drugs were causing all these, soldiers to commit atrocities, or turn on themselves, or was blaming drugs for a lot of the problem in the U.S. Army in the Vietnam War. And some psychologists, and that's how I got into this topic, because I was reading Army reports by Army psychiatrists and some published articles that actually said some soldiers had relatively good experience with drugs in the horrible environment of Vietnam. The drug was for them a coping mechanism, and their experience wasn't entirely negative, and that drugs didn't necessarily have a negative impact on combat capabilities. They felt alcohol had much worse. And of course, there's also not a hangover effect. And then when a lot were removed from the war environment and came back to the U.S., they went on to normal life. The study showed that the percentage of soldiers who stayed on drugs after the war was very low. And it showed they weren't really physically addicted. It was more the environment of Vietnam. So the views of a lot of drug experts actually correlate with some of Leary's ideas, which I think were innovative. But then I think he took it too far when he started, becoming this drug proselytizer, that by turning on a generation, they would become more spiritual and enlightened, and this would pave the way to a peaceful society. And I think that was an illusion. And this article kind of, found, and this I only learned in more recent years, and after starting to work with Covert Action, which investigates the CIA, that Leary actually had these connections with the CIA, and admitting to being a CIA agent, and was involved with MK Ultra, and came to the assessment that although some of his ideas I think were progressive initially, he took it too far with the drug proselytizing, and is actually an agent or asset of the CIA. and this was part of a plan to de-radicalize the '60s, new left, and depoliticize and turn the youth away from political activism, kind of inward into the drug culture, which was ultimately self-destructive. So.
Right. I mean, he was there were apple seeds, but he was maybe one of the foremost proselytizers or public gurus for LSD. Would you agree with that? I mean, I can't think of anybody who comes to mind who advocated it more publicly than Leary.
Yes, and I think that was his role because the CIA and as I read more into this topic, the CIA had done a huge array of experiments with LSD covertly in the 1950s and saw as this potential magic drug, that they could program people in interrogation, use it to kind of well, I think the CIA was trying to develop Manchurian candidates who could carry out assassination or who they can control or get prisoners of war to divulge information. So they were doing all kinds of tests through the Operation MK Ultra on LSD, often very unethical tests where they would spike the drinks or test people unwittingly or give them a lot of LSD to prisoners. And that was drove some to madness. But I think Leary was the one. So I think the CIA developed the idea that maybe we can kind of brainwash or we can use it to our own purpose. If we get the youth to turn on to LSD, then they'll turn inward, and it was a way to de-radicalize and depoliticize. So it was kind of mass experiment. What they were doing with MK Ultra on an internal level, they wanted to do on a mass experiment. And I think Leary was there on these youth and to try and program their minds. And Leary was the guy because he was this showman. He was a very charismatic personality. I think he may have believed in the virtues of the drug. I think they connected. He was kind of groomed for that role, as I found in reading into this. And there was a meeting with him and Marshall McLuhan, who was a genius in marketing. And I think McLuhan gave him some ideas and helped him develop the slogan. McLuhan would develop slogan for companies, catchy slogan to sell the product. So he pushed Leary, I think, on this slogan, tune in, turn on, and drop out, as a kind of catchy slogan that, you had this rebellious generation. So with this catchy slogan, and then another PR coup, which he may have got from McLuhan, was he gave this interview with Playboy magazine that claimed that LSD made people have more, women would have great sexual experience and orgasms if they took LSD, or multiple orgasms in one sex session. And that got a lot of young women excited about trying and taking LSD. And in hindsight, that was a great PR coup to get that in Playboy. So these were some marketing things that he did, and he, made the connection. So he was invited to the big rallies they had, whether the Being or some of the big
The Human Being of what was it, 67, I think.
Yeah,
Golden Gate Park. That's a famous event. Yeah,
he was one of the major speakers in those events, so he could promote his ideas, and he was a very charismatic guy. So he was, and the CIA, they're smart when they select these people. They select people with particular personalities. And actually, it should be noted that Leary himself, because Leary was a very, very intelligent person, and when he was a professor, he was a PhD from Berkeley, and then he taught in the psychology department at Berkeley, and he actually developed a personality test that the CIA used as far as their own recruitment and their own promotional standards. And he had written a book on a psychology book in the mid-50s that was very highly acclaimed.
He actually said that when he was put in jail in the 70s, they gave him a test for his personality test. It was one of the personality tests he had written. So it went full circle. And he was also very buttoned down in the 50s. He was a hellraiser. He was also had military connection. He went to West Point and got kicked out. but he's a button-down kind of professor. You see these old pictures of him like a 50s guy, and then in the 60s, here he is looking like he is right here, where it's like peace and love, and I wear Indian clothing or something like that.
Well, and he was playing a role. See, his book that he wrote in the mid 50s was about how society assigns people different roles, and people kind of play those roles. And he actually said, I was kind of assigned the role of this middle class, bourgeois professor. And he actually didn't want to play that role. He kind of saw a kind of certain hollowness in that, middle class bourgeois life. And he didn't want to play the role of the organizational man because, he had always had this rebellious streak, and he was always kind of womanizer. So I think he relished in the role, but this was like a role that in some ways was assigned to him as this hippie spiritual guru. So he played the part perfectly with his dress and demeanor. And I think it was part of his image that he had himself dropped out because he had been the organizational man of the 50s on this successful career track in academia, and he was having a very successful academic career. But then he just dropped out and played the new role of this spiritual guru. But it was all kind of fraud because he was leading the youth down a path of destruction, and that's why Ramparts had an article, which was a 60s countercultural magazine and anti-establishment magazine, and they compared him to a fictional character, Elmer Gantry, who kind of leads his flock astray. So, and there were certain aspects of his person. I think he was kind of a phony in some ways, and he wasn't a good father, and he was in some ways very, very selfish and in his own personal life, narcissistic is the word.
And he had critics. I mean, Hunter S. Thompson thought he was a fraud too, right? So
yeah,
people who'd been around the hate, like he had been, like, oh, this guy's a baloney. And he also, like, one of the things that's an omission from his life that isn't there is anything to stop the war, right? So he's never really actively anti-war. He's just like, drop out, don't worry about it, right? So it's almost like he's promoting this hippie culture that Jolly and West studied, who you mentioned in the article, right?
well, yeah, and I think that's why he was valued by the CIA, because he was pushing the path of the youth on a path of depoliticization, and that's, you have the transformation from the we generation of the 60s to the me generation of the 70s, where you have this kind of obsession with self-improvement, and some may have moved away from drugs but more into kind of personal lifestyle and yoga and meditation and spirituality and healthy living, which is good for the individual. But if that's the obsession, that there's no longer this collective movement or obsession with trying to improve society. And I mean, a lot of his politics, were actually very regressive because he favored more right-wing policy, where the left would advocate higher taxes on the rich and government, maybe nationalization of some major industries. When he ran for governor of California, he ran to Reagan's right on many issues. Like he was calling for privatizing all universities, and I have it in the article, and he actually kind of mocked the left. Like he said that in the in the 30s, 40s, you had the old left with the labor movement, the socialist parties, and he kind of mocked them. And he actually favored more right-wing policies. And he was very slow to come out against the Vietnam War. He did come out against it, but because he had to play the role of this mentor to a generation that turned against the Vietnam. But he was very late in coming out to it, and he had supported the Cold War. He had actually been involved, and this may have been when he was recruited in the CIA, because he was involved in an organization with Cord Meyer. I think it was a major CIA operative. I think it was a
Cord Meyer set up Operation Mockingbird. So, like, he has a relationship with this guy. It's incredible.
Yeah, and this was like, he was part of this veterans group, and they denounced Henry Wallace. Like, they adopted a kind of middle-of-the-road Cold War position, Cold War liberal position, denouncing Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was the vice president of Roosevelt, and then he was basically removed in a coup because he was advocating for cooperation with the Russians and the closing down of U.S. overseas air bases, and that the U.S. shouldn't pursue a Cold War but should establish friendly relation with the Soviet Union, even if America didn't agree with the Soviet model of government. And Leary aligned with Cord Meyer and purging people with that view from this group they were part of back in the 40s. And he identified as a Cold Warrior, and he said that this war is not going to be a war with weapons; it's a war for men's minds, and that's the exact view of the CIA. That's why the CIA invested so much in propaganda, like with the Operation Mockingbird, and they're the Congress of Cultural Freedom, where they're funding all these intellectuals, because the CIA understood it as a war for the mind, and that's why Leary was an asset. And they thought, the CIA initially thought that drugs could be a way to control people's minds. And that's where Leary came in, to push drugs on them. And I think in a way that's what they were doing with the 60s movement. They were trying to direct them toward mass drug use and away from political activism, and promoting this kind of lifestyle, a cultural revolution, which was less damaging to the ruling elite than a political revolution, which is what they did not want. So he was key in pushing for a cultural revolution through drugs, and that could be a way to control the youth, I think, in the eye of the CIA. So that's why he was an asset. And I don't think he admitted to being a CIA asset. I don't think they told them always exactly what to do. He came up with a lot of things, I think, on his own, but he was ultimately serving the agenda of the CIA and the ruling class. And a lot of the youth didn't realize that until much later.
Right. Here's a picture of Cord Meyer and his wife, Mary. They're young, but I think they got divorced fairly young at that time, in their mid 30s or something like that. And then she went on and was mysteriously dead on the Georgetown locks in '64. That's a whole nother story in itself, which is fraught with intrigue. And
But
Leary,
Leary knew Mary Meyer. Yeah, he turned her on. She asked him to get. She wanted him to turn her on to acid, and actually, there's a theory that she was trying to turn on JFK so that they could get, because she had an affair with JFK, and it may have been an MK Ultra experiment that was done on JFK to get him maybe to reveal certain secrets, or the purpose is not clear. But yeah, I think she knew too much, both about the assassination and also, I think, about the MK Ultra. And then she was murdered by the CIA, very likely. But she had a strong connection with Leary.
yeah, wasn't there a story of James Jesus Angleton coming to her house after she died and taking her diary, Mary Pinchot
Yes.
Meyer's diary? Yeah, so
Yeah, there's a book, if people are interested. There's a book by Peter Janney, who's the son of a CIA agent who's very close with the Myers, and he investigated the murder. And yeah, he discussed how Angleton stole her diary, and he pieced it together that it was very clear the CIA was behind her murder.
and literally blamed it on the black guy, like some kind of
Yeah.
low, not high functioning African American, if I remember correctly.
Correct. And then you can check out my article on the topic, which is on Covert Action, which is draws a lot on the Janney book, but also a few other sources. But yeah, it was, I think it was a kind of mentally feeble guy, but ultimately they couldn't convict him because witnesses actually said the real killer was much taller, and he was found not guilty in his trial. But the actual culprit was never identified.
And she's kind of left out as, like, with the deaths. Like, there was a book, I wish I could remember the actor's name, but I think it's called Kill List. But she's like one of the ones who died after JFK died, November 22nd in '63. A lot of other people, like, who knew JFK or around that administration, died mysteriously, and she was one of them. In addition to Kilgallen, the '60s was really rough. Like, there were hits. There are a lot of them going on, so I think she was one of them. But her ties to Leary are something else. Like, so, and I think he knew her personally. So, Like
I
they
think they had an affair as well because Leary was a very charming and good-looking guy, and that's why I think he was selected for this. They saw that he was perfect for this role of kind of this, spiritual guru. He had the good, the Hollywood good looks and the charming, outgoing personality.
did you ever know that if he worked under this guy Murray, which is just absolutely incredible, that you validate that in your article, right? Arthur
But yeah,
Henry
that's
Murray.
interesting. The milieu he was working in. Well, in general, I've been studying the connection between the CIA and academia is very, very deep, extending through the present day. I actually have a forthcoming series of articles that will be published as a back to school special in August, one that deals with the CIA offshoot National Endowment for Democracy and how there many professors come from the National Endowment for Democracy, and they're promoting propaganda, not education. But yeah, this goes back a long, long way, intimate tie between academia and the CIA. So a lot of the people Leary worked with at the University of California, Berkeley, and then he was brought to Harvard uh, in the early 60s. And these people were all connected to the OSS or the CIA. And there's,
Murray was one of the guys, one of the key guys who did the Mind of Adolf Hitler. He worked with, they used to call it the Langer Report, but I think Murray was involved in all that. And as you mentioned in your article, Kaczynski, that's a 3-year kind of mind control process on Kaczynski. They literally put a freaking helmet, like something from Clockwork Orange, on Kaczynski and made him feel terrible about himself. I mean, he came out the other way, like, changed person. Like and Murray was there. Murray was the guy involved.
yeah, and they were running. I mean, totally unethical stuff was going on in America under the cover of American universities, and they're running these MK Ultra projects in American universities. One of the worst was at McGill with this Ewan Cameron, who was doing like these enhanced interrogation techniques and sleep deprivation, and also lobotomies and different kind of experiments, and it did a lot of damage to a lot of the people who were being used in these experiments. Uh, and you wonder also about the curriculum, like what are they teaching students as well? I think in the case of Harvard and Leary, I mean, they were doing LSD testing on students, involving students. And it was directly funded by the CIA, and it was being used for the Operation MK Ultra.
Isn't Victoria Newland associated with the NED? I thought that she
Yes,
was.
yes,
Okay,
she's on
so
the
it's still
board of
around.
the NED. And what's not, I think, well understood, and hopefully this article will be forthcoming, will help better inform people that a huge number of professors are associated with the NED in this Journal of Democracy they have, which is not an objective journal. It just promotes propaganda and demonization of countries, that the U.S. targets for regime change, like Russia or China or Venezuela, any socialist country. And these professors are all over, around the country, are getting hired at top universities, and as they're moving toward the adjunct system, the majority of people are struggling. People who get PhDs and want to go into teaching, they can't find full-time positions. The only people who are getting full-time positions are those affiliated with NED. In many cases, and it's skewing public, the education.
Oh,
But
sorry
this is a
about that.
long-standing problem. Yeah, there's a book by Robin Winks called Cloak and Gown that discusses the CIA and OSS influence on campuses in the 50s and 60s. And many well-known professors had ties with the CIA, and the CIA is often able to control academic field through the promotion system and the running the journals and who gets published and the prestigious journals and things like that. They control various fields, including things like Russian studies, a key field like that. And then MK Ultra, there's a lot of the George. It's George Washington, the National Security Archive, which is based at George Washington University. It's a very good organization that sues for the release of classified government documents. And they had a whole thing on MK Ultra in the last couple of years, based, I think it was published a year or two ago, based on all these new documents they got released. And they pointed to very extensive MK Ultra activity, and that many professors on campuses across the U.S., both Ivy League schools and schools like the University of Oklahoma, were involved with the MK Ultra.
That's Jolly West. I think Gittinger too was from the University of Oklahoma as well. But
yeah,
at
so
one point, it's really incredible. Like they just utilize so many different people. And I think even to this day, when I was in law school in the 90s, there were a couple professors that were rumored to be either just stone cold intel, and they were like talent spotters and kind of controlling the other professors, like this is what you can teach and all this other stuff. So people who think that these guys in academia, and you probably may know this more than me, are just pure academics without kind of intel ties or things like that, it's not the case. There's a lot of that stuff out there. But you mentioned in this article this really interesting video that I found, and I had it, but it's from February 16th, 1975, and in it are all these people associated with either MK Ultra and or the LSD: Al Hubbard, Timothy Leary, Laura Huxley, the wife of Aldous, and some of these names I don't. But you mentioned Humphrey Osmond, right? And then John C. Lilly. Have you ever seen this video? You had to have seen this video, right?
yes, I watched that, and yeah, it is a remarkable video. And they're kind of looking back on this LSD revolution and what they achieved, and they seem to be, true believers in their cause. But yeah, this guy Al Hubbard was on there, and he had an intelligence. What you find is that a lot of these people have intelligence background. Like Colonel Al Hubbard was referred to as the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. Yeah, there it is. And he was actually friendly with Ronald Reagan. So, I mean, we think of the 60s movement as kind of subversive, and, Ronald Reagan was staunch conservative, but Hubbard was close with Reagan. So it really is a kind of conservative agenda in some ways. And then, yeah, I think he connected a lot of people with LSD. Hubbard was a key guy, and he had an intelligence background. So that shows you how the intelligence agencies were the one pushing drugs as part of. I think it was a combination of just an experiment combined with an effort to, once the 60s movements took root and started to be a threat to the ruling establishment, to try and channel them into a cultural rather than political revolution.
And I think you're right. It shows that something about Leary is not really right. Like he's not. And you said even the guy who's the guy who wrote Soul on Ice. He's like they're telling him he's an agent or something when he's in
Yeah.
Algeria.
They suspected him because they saw through, a lot of people who knew him just saw through him, that he was a showman, and he was enjoying himself, but he was really leading people on a destructive path, and he was not a serious person as far as political engagement or activism. And his ideas, and this is when the CIA infiltrates or co-ops political movement, they'll push kind of zany. That's part of their strategy, is to push zany ideas that's not going to build a broad movement, and that's not going to be productive for society. So diverting people in those movements from legitimate or constructive program to build a genuine social movement into something just kind of zany, like turning on to drugs is going to be the solution for all the world's problems, and really it's creating a lot more problems for a lot of people. So
I see Leary kind of in the vein as like Ruth Payne, who was like the person in Irving, Texas, where Marina and Oswald were around, or Marina stayed at her house, but like externally she was in left wing movements, but she had like these kind of like ties, like Mel and Hitchcock. They may not have been like pure CIA agents, but may have been. But like all their friend network and stuff like that are all East Coast elites, right? So there's commonalities there. Would you agree with that?
yes, I would, and I think the CIA has huge budget. People, and it's hard to see at the time. If you're involved in these movements, but I mean, this is a strategy that the ruling class uses to try and manipulate and co-opt these movements by planting agents like Leary to, as I was just pointing out, get that movement to adopt, zany ideas that they're not going to be able to build a broader political movement, like around the idea of taking drugs as a solution to societal problems, and pushing these groups into destructive activities. And there are many examples with the 60s movements. Like there's a book about the Symbionese. I did a review of this book, an excellent book by Brad Schreiber on the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was
Revolution's End, yeah.
yeah, it was a creation of the CIA to manipulate, to try and discredit the Bay Area left wing movements that were pushing for more progressive policy, like ending that would be actually popular among a huge percentage of the public, like ending the Vietnam War, reducing military spending, more spending on healthcare and education, maybe higher taxes on the wealthy. But instead, the Symbionese Liberation Army, a CIA creation, pushed this like ultra-radical agenda, referred to all police officers as pigs, and started doing criminal acts like robbing banks, and then kidnapped Patty Hearst and brainwashed her and got her to participate in these criminal activities with them, and that associated the Bay Area left and anti-war movement with extremism and terrorism, and or criminality. And it's the same with there are a lot of suspicions about the Weather Underground, that there were agents there pushing this ultra radicalism and violent tactics that would alienate a lot of the population. And then Billy Ayers and Bernadine Dorn, they didn't get any jail. People were further suspicious because they got no jail time, and they became prominent professors in later years when they had been involved in clearly terroristic type activity. So I think Leary fits with that pattern of the CIA trying to manipulate the social movement of the 60s to discredit them or divert them, and so that these movements wouldn't be a threat to the ruling establishment. And they were seen as a threat. I mean, the Trilateral Commission, which was an elite body funded by David Rockefeller, financed a study on the 60s put out by Sam Huntington, a Harvard professor who had connection to the CIA, and it was called The Excesses of Democracy of the 60s movements. And basically Huntington said we want to go back to the 40s when America was run by a small number of elite bankers. We don't have the people rallying in the streets against the Pentagon and all the minority groups clamoring for their rights. That was a threat to the ruling elite. So they had to find a way to neuter that threat. And Leary was their key agent, get them to take drugs and to promote these zany ideas, and alienates the majority of the public who don't want their kids on drugs and don't want to take drugs themselves. So, and identifies the 60s movement as something negative, when really it started as a movement for peaceful change and democracy, society, and more rights for minority groups and women, and more attention to the environment and less spending on military.
It's incredible. I've never heard of that document, but I'm not surprised it was written. But like Revolution's End is one of my favorite books. It's an incredible book,
Yeah.
because Schreiber talks about pre-knowledge of Hearst and Daniel DeFries, I think was his name, or DeFries, that they knew each other before, but that was never published in the media as far as I remember. And there's just so many things. And it's very similar to the Soul on Ice guy. I keep forgetting. Eldridge Cleaver sniffing out Leary, is because Schreiber made the point that none of the African American guys believed DeFries. They thought there was something sus about him, but the kind of well-meaning middle-class bourgeois liberals maybe were really on board. They were almost all there wasn't anything. They were all white men and women following DeFries, is my understanding. So it's an interesting element. And then actually your article adds on to Schreiber's work, because I didn't know that Leary was at that hospital at the same time in 73. And if I remember correctly, a lot of the activity of the Symbionese Liberation SLA, Symbionese Liberation Army, happened, I think, in 73 or 74, right? Is that the time frame?
Correct. Yeah, he could have been. Yeah, because that's where they brought him. I mean, he was allegedly convicted of some crime. So why did they bring him there? And they said that he was not really a prisoner, that he was involved in all kinds of experiments at the hospital, and that he had a nurse who he would I guess, have sex with every day or something. So he was actually enjoying himself. And I think that gets to the point that he was an asset and that he was continuously involved in mind control projects. And one of those was to develop these ultra radical cults. Because that was the purpose originally behind MK Ultra, was to use drugs to be able to manipulate people and control people, and get them to do what you want. And that's what they did with DeFreeze, and they made him into this kind of cult leader. Um, and they used psychologists like Leary, who understand the human mind quite well and how it could be manipulated, and how certain categories of people, like these youth you're describing, because you had a lot of youth who were radicalized, and in the '60s, and I think the CIA saw an opportunity to try and manipulate these radicalized youth into something destructive, like
Right.
Symbiotic Liberation Army.
Did you ever have any connection of any of this stuff to Operation Chaos? Like, I mean, there's that famous book that came out, but it seems like there's like overlapping like social engineering movements taking place, whether it's the hippies, tune in, dropout, Leary, SLA, Manson family. Manson and Leary actually had adjoining cells at one point, I think in 72, 73. But did you ever make any connections to Operation Chaos? Do you find that that's credible or valid?
I don't know specifically about that. It may very well be. As far as, yeah, Manson, that's, yeah, because I think FDR once said there's no coincidence in politics. If it happens a certain way, it was planned that way. So if you see Leary and Manson together, there's probably a reason for that, and they're both really working for the same purpose. So
Yeah, I think so. It's just absolutely. And there was another guy who was affiliated with them, Colston Westbrook. I can't believe I remember his name, but he came out of Operation Phoenix. He was literally like the Phoenix program in Vietnam, and then all of a sudden, he's like friends with DeFreeze in a hospital where they're doing tests in all these other places, Atascadero, and it's just that California was just like a petri dish of all kinds of strange stuff going on.
yeah, it was
Um,
also the case. I had an article about the Jonestown and Jim Jones, and how he had actually worked for the CIA, and that was also a kind of CIA operation, to help destroy the '60s movements by getting them to join this religious cult. And then he brought them to Guyana, and they were doing MK Ultra experiments there, because the MK Ultra was formally ended with the Church Committee hearing, but then it was continued through religious cults. Uh, and yeah, it's confirmed that Jones had worked for the CIA in the 1960s in Brazil. So I think, yeah, people should connect all these things together: Symbionese Liberation Army, the Jonestown, the Leary. It was all part of an effort to destroy the '60s era movements. Uh,
and the guy there was more than an active critic of the CIA. I forgot the representative who was killed.
Leo Ryan, yeah,
Yeah,
Leo Ryan was on to something horrible going on with Jonestown, and he was lured there, and then they murdered him. And he had sponsored the Ryan Hughes Act in Congress, which was one of the strongest anti-CIA legislation that would force Congress to, basically gave Congress a lot of power, that the CIA had to report all its activity, and it had to be rubber stamped by Congress and congressional committees. And yeah, they had Ryan murdered, and he was considered the foremost congressional critic of the CIA, probably
right.
ever.
That's
And,
right.
and he was lured to Jonestown and assassinated by Army officers in fatigues. And then they blamed this hapless guy for the killing. And they said he had been he looked like a zombie. He had been drugged and manipulated. But he would, I forget his name. It's in my article on Jonestown. But he clearly was not the assassin. He was like a patsy, and they drugged him. And that's how one purpose of MK Ultra is to drug people and manipulate them and
Right.
set
It's
them
to
up.
make the perfect patsy. That's the whole
Yeah,
thing, is that
exactly.
there's a whole like we've I read one of your earlier articles. I think it was the Mel MLK article, and James Earl Ray's hypnotism and strange movements, and he's like the perfect patsy. He doesn't remember anything. He's like Chapman and some of these other characters. Like,
Mhm.
wow, it's really something else. And the John Judge has done a lot of really great research about Jonestown, and I think
Yes.
his research it was that it was like a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. Like they could have drugged. I forgot what he said, but it was like there were so many drugs there. It was way beyond the requirements or necessities of 1,000-person town or whatever. Like they were just using crazy amounts of drugs and stuff. And that's the real story is that those people weren't probably shot. They were probably injected or something weird. Like the whole thing was just super duper dark, like really bad. And there's a known, for people who don't know, Jim Jones actually references a known CIA asset. He's like, "Get Dyer out of here" on one of these tapes of recordings. They're like, "Get him out of here." And then also, I think that there was also strange murders after the event too in California, if I remember. Like some people like met unfortunate ends after Jonestown. So there's a lot going on in California. Like, wow, it's just really something else. And he was friends. Jones was friends with this guy Mangione. I can't remember his name or
Dan
the
Mitrione, yeah.
Mitrione. Yeah,
Yeah, and actually some, Judge, yeah, because I drew heavily on Judge's research and another author, Michael Myers, and there's suspicion, although it's not proven, that this guy Dwyer may have actually been Mitrione, who was a police advisor in Uruguay, who worked undercover for the CIA in police training programs, and was known for promoting torture methods. In these police programs, which I studied at length for a research project that I did. But then, yeah, they both came from the same town in Indiana. That's where Joan was from, a small town in Indiana. Happened to be the same town, Mitrione, and they were close friends from childhood. And then some researchers found an uncanny resemblance between Dwyer and Mitrione, and that even the age they gave Dwyer, that Dwyer looked a bit older. They said he was in his 40s, but really he looked like a man in his late 50s, which would be the age of Mitrione at that time. And it may have been a cover story that Mitrione was murdered. They claim that Mitrione was murdered by the left-wing Tupamaro in Uruguay. But now this is a theory; it's not proven, but it's a possibility. This it's not past the CIA. If you study the CIA, they will fake people's deaths. They're interested in manipulating public opinion, the news cycle, and so it's possible they faked Mitrione's death as a way to discredit this left-wing group in Uruguay, and that it was actually him working in Guyana in the U.S. Embassy with Jones, and that's the guy. They gave him a name, Dwyer. But yeah, Jones was caught on video. You're right. There's an audio saying, "Get Dwyer out of here," because he knew they were all going to be assassinated. It was proven that all the people at Jonestown were gunned down. They didn't drink Kool-Aid,
okay,
as people
yeah, that's
claim.
right.
They were assassinated.
And I think Jones had like a shot to the back of the head, if I remember.
Yeah, and
I
there's
don't,
suspicion actually that Jones himself that got away, that they faked Jones's death because the gun was found very far from him, and the body, it was somebody who looked like Jones, but closer investigation determined that it probably was not Jones because there are various indicator that it actually was not Jones, and it's believed that the CIA may have helped him to escape to Brazil, where he had lived before. And the CIA creates body doubles, and they hire actors, and they have Hollywood, people who can do makeup, and they've employed real professionals in that area, so they can fake people's deaths pretty effectively. Now, it's not again and studying these topics, you have to, I wouldn't say it's 100% that is true, but it looks suspicious that they may have very well have faked his death.
it's just it's just the incredible. That's 78. I grew up in Northern California, so that was all over the news. It was just so incredible. And there was like a 2 or 3 day delay after the events and like before it hit the media, if I remember correctly. Like there was a bunch of things that happened about that event, but Yeah, I mean, and just the fact that Leary's all the way around there, and then all of a sudden he kind of drops out with a lot of money, right? You mentioned that in your article that the 60s or 70s kind of ended and he just became kind of like an icon. Would you agree with that?
Well, that's true. Yeah. How does he have, people were questioning. I mean, I think he had a nice home in Beverly Hills and, in the 80s, but he hadn't been employed. His last employment was at Harvard. He was fired from Harvard. I think it was actually a cover story. I think the cover story that he was fired for dispensing LSD to students unwittingly at Harvard. Although other accounts I read said that he just stopped teaching his classes. And then he went to work. He continued his drug experiments under the funding of this guy, William Mellon Hitchcock, who was an heir of one of the wealthiest banking dynasties in America, and had strong connection to the CIA. And it's believed that that maybe was all set up of the CIA to make it look like he was this renegade professor who believed in the merits of LSD, that this was going to be this magic peace drug, and he nobly was doing these experiments and was fired because of his beliefs. But really, he just stopped showing up to class, and he was more a kind of con man, as we've been discussing. And then they set him up with the CIA, all this money from the CIA to continue all these drug experiments and to really publicize it before the mainstream. And actually, yeah, like he also cultivated a relationship with rock musicians, and this was deliberate to like influence. Today we have these TikTok influencers, but in those days there was people like Allen Ginsberg was the beatnik poet, was very famous, and these rock stars emerging like Jimi Hendrix. So people, I think, in the CIA or somebody powerful put Leary in touch with these people to get them to promote LSD. And this while he was working with William Mellon Hitchcock, with CIA funding. So, and we know that the history of the CIA supporting MK Ultra and agenda of the CIA. So, not too hard to put two and two together. But then, yeah, after his whole odyssey, and then he had a few years in prison, and miraculously, he was in prison for I think he was on a marijuana charge or something, and then the Weather Underground broke him out of prison. How did he escape from prison if he didn't have some higher authorities helping him? you know, and then eventually, after he got out of prison, and the '60s were over, what is he going to? He has no job, but I mean, he was able to make a lot of money through speaking tours. But then, and he did a tour with G. Gordon Liddy, one of the Watergate Nixon people. But then he got involved with like some weird projects like space travel, and that was tied also with some groups that had connection, like with the military industrial complex and intelligence agencies. So, he was not involved in progressive causes, and that's why many people, like in the '80s, you still had people who were well known in the '60s movement, like Abby Hoffman, were still very active in some of the same causes, fighting for the environment. Hoffman was involved in the movement to try and get the CIA off campus. This is in the '80s. So a lot of the '60s people were still, very active in the '80s in the same kind of issues because they believed in it, in a more peaceful society, the environment, more humane society, and they devoted their life to fighting for these causes. But Leary was not involved at all. He was just involved in this movement, like to get humans to be able to live in outer space or something, which is more fantasy. So it goes to show he was not really a progressive, like what you were saying. He would not really. I think he made some statements at certain points against the Vietnam War, but he was not very active from an early point in trying to really oppose the Vietnam War. And the policies he was promoting, when he ran for governor, were right-wing policies. So, yeah, he's never really a progressive guy, and it would add to the belief that he was some kind of agent.
Like a cultural change agent or something like that.
Yeah.
Like always. And it's also because he became kind of like a futurist guru too.
Mhm.
So it's like space travel, panspermia, computers, networking, uh, speculating about the future. So he kind of, I think he was on the kind of uh, interview, or what is it called, like promotion tour or speaking tours or something like that, as an expert.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Yeah, he was this is kind of celebrity, but he was more kind of narcissistic, more about himself. I mean, and some of the issues were interesting he was dealing with, but he was supporting, but they weren't really, something that was associated with like, social justice cause. And again, comparing him with other, key figures in the '60s movement like Abby Hoffman, were dedicated to the same issue they had fought for all along, which why people would consider them more authentic political activists.
Jeremy, I know you have a hard stop in a few minutes. Do you have time for a few questions?
Yeah, yeah, I've
Okay.
got 30 minutes. I
Okay.
only have to leave around 6:30 my time. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Maple says, I don't know if this is common knowledge, but Timothy Leary is the inspiration for Roy Batty and Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. I was not aware of that, but he was an inspiration for some Beatles songs and things like that. Like he was culturally keyed in. I think you mentioned that, something like that in your article, Jeremy. Do you know of any connection between Jim Jones and Harvey Milk?
That's interesting. I think the Michael Myers, if you're interested in that, there may be a connection, and there are a lot of fishy thing that went on in the murder of Harvey Milk. And I forget, was it the
Dan
mayor,
White? Oh, Moscone?
George
Moscone.
Moscone, was murdered. Uh, and they used the murderer. They used this Twinkie defense that he had taken too many Twinkies, and the murderer got off with like a extremely light sentence using this Twinkie defense, and it raised a lot of suspicion. And that's how Dianne Feinstein got elevated in local politics in San Francisco, and Harvey Milk and Jordan Moscone were much more progressive figures. Yeah, they were murdered, I think, by the deep state. We want to use that term, and I think there is a connection, but I'm not an expert on that. There is an excellent I don't know if it was published as a book. It's a monograph by Michael Myers. I think it's available free on the internet. That I would recommend this viewer consult. Michael Myers, spelled Meiers. I forget the name of this monograph, but if you type in Michael Myers
Let's see if I
and
can find it.
Jonestown, I think you'd find it through the internet, and I believe you
Because
can read it for free.
those
Makes,
things
yeah,
happen right
he
next to
does
each
make
other,
a
maybe a
connection.
week
Yeah,
apart, right?
yeah, he makes a connection, and I forget all the detail that he goes into, but he's got a good argument, some good information in that. That would be a good starting point for understanding that. But I think there is a connection.
One of
Uh,
the sus things about Dan White is that he was in Vietnam, is my understanding. So, like these
yeah,
guys who went Vietnam, they go through, and there's a lot of testing on these military guys. And there was something Dan White made weird decisions because he made it all the way to like a board of advisor and then quit and then wanted his job back, which is like you're not thinking things through. Like you've attained something. That's was supposedly his gripe against Milk, is that they didn't want to give him his job as like a San Francisco advisor or something back. But why did he kill Moscone? Like it's
yeah, he had no real motive for doing so. And you're right, he had been in Vietnam, and that's where they often use these hypnosis techniques or MK Ultra experiments using soldiers. Uh,
there's
so
so many stories, Jeremy, of guys who've gone to Vietnam. They came back serial killers or murderers, or they're strange, and some are like flat out MK Ultra type people. But
Mhm.
it's a good question, and there's a lot of open questions there. One of the interesting factoids about Dan White is, guess who was one of his best friends in jail? Sirhan. Like you can't write this stuff. This is like true. This is a true story. I'm absolutely not kidding. Do you know? Here's a question from Irish Rooster. Was Jim Jones an MK Ultra kid? Do you know anything about that?
Uh, I'm not sure about that. I know that he was outed as a CIA agent in Brazil in the 1960s. He was involved in a coup and a kind of divide and rule strategy. And he was also in Guyana. And I think his job was to sow division between the Indian Afro-Guyanese population as a precondition for a coup against Chedi Jagan, who was a socialist leader who was Indian, and they brought in Forbes Burnham, who was Afro-Guyanese, but proved to be a pro-CIA, pro-U.S. dictator. But he allowed the Jonestown in Guyana. I think Joan was, he was a brilliant preacher. I think they may have identified him. You see, the CIA sometimes will identify, certain personalities who have that quality of a leader or have the charisma, public speaking ability. And Joan was a brilliant preacher who could, he really whipped people up during his sermons, and he was very good at manipulating people. So I don't know that he was involved with MK Ultra in any way. It is a possibility, or the other possibility is that they just identified him. And actually, there's evidence going back to the early '50s that he collaborated with the FBI in identifying communists. So he may have developed a connection, and it may have been an extreme right winger, in the McCarthy years, and through connection with intelligence agencies and his skill as a preacher and at manipulating people, he got drawn into the agency's orbit.
Marby asked, would you classify Jones's church as liberation theology? I don't know if you know about that, or has the Catholic Church also been infiltrated by the CIA? That wouldn't be surprising at all. But do you have any thoughts on those questions?
Well, I know that Joan was promoting, like he was trying to bring the races together, and he drew a lot of progress. Like when he moved to Berkeley, he was drawing people from the counterculture movement who wanted to have some religion in their life. And yeah, there was something. It was somewhat comparable to liberation theology, but he may have been a con man like Leary, a narcissist who had been used for a broader project. So whether he believed in it or not is uncertain.
Gerald Hall asked you a question. How has this manufactured culture eroded public trust, making modern populations highly susceptible to algorithmic control, gaslighting, state-sanctioned narratives? What do you think about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, yeah, well, that's a very good question. Yeah, I would agree that you have to go back in time, because I think the '60s movement was really about developing a kind of critical, independent thinking, and it was kind of anti-authority, questioning authority, like with the Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was a kind of iconic book. And there were a lot of the writers that were influential in that era, whether the Beatniks or Paul Goodman, they were, critiquing society and societal institutions and promoting this kind of anti-authoritarian impulse, and to question authority and think for yourself, and that's what was a danger. So I agree. They tried to they use all kind of different methods to disrupt these movements, to try and control people through drugs or depoliticize them or maybe destroy their brains. And there's a massive propaganda offensive we've experienced over generations, to try and restore the conformity that existed before the '60s. And I think it's worked to a large extent. And we see it in so many different ways today. And now you have this new tech oligarchy, and they're pushing stuff over the internet. Yeah, I think it's important to look at the history and some of the techniques that they've used to control minds and to reestablish I think the '60s movements was something very positive in pushing independent and critical thinking, and we need to build off the impulses of that generation.
They say, the stories of like San Francisco in the '60s was like an idyllic utopia before it went dark. Like people really believed in a lot of that stuff. And it was like, so now I think as we got older, people look back and go, this dark thing in Manson, but it wasn't always like that. You'll hear stories of guys before, 67 or 66, like, wow, this is really a wonderful place. And everybody, and then it like people brought in meth and like this dark energy or something. So you like, there really, in my opinion, in my reading of the culture, there really was some kind of positive movement taking place, and I think it got subverted. So.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of my point in the article, because I think the hippie movement was to establish more cooperative society and culture, share more, be less materialistic. I think there was, a lot of solidarity in that generation, community, that's lacking. A lot of people today are very isolated. They're always, alone on their computers. And studies have shown that there's a lot of depression and lack of social bonding and solidarity. And I think the value of the hippie movement was to create a more humane society, more in tune with the environment. Look back more to Native American culture and how they were to live respectively with the environment, not as destructive as Judeo-Christian culture, which see the environment as just something to generate wealth from. And also the warlike nature. They're trying to move away from the warlike nature of society. And look how that's played out in the last several decades. It's been horrendous for humanity. All these terrible wars across the Middle East and Libya, Syria, Ukraine, Russia. So the hippie movement was something very positive, very hopeful. And that's why they had to hijack it and subvert it and associate that. A lot of the younger people associate that with something negative. They only associate now with the drug use rather than the ideal that movement stood for. And that's, I think, Leary set the groundwork for all that.
I think you're right. Gerald asks, does Jeremy know about Leary's connection to Carol Rosin, Rosin, Werner von Braun's secretary to Leary? Speaking of space travel, are you familiar with that? I'm not.
That's interesting. I'm not familiar with that, but I know, the Nazi were very big. And, some viewer of the show may be familiar with Mae Brussel, who was a pioneer in studying
I've
deep
done a
politics.
couple shows on her, yeah.
Yeah, and she talked a lot about the Nazification of America. And the space program was part of that, because that was a Nazi dream to establish control over outer space, to be able to control the whole world and use space to survey and identify all the mineral deposits and just to control the world through control of space. So the paperclip brought all these Nazis, and Brussels spoke about how Nixon was a key figure in bringing Dulles, bringing all these Nazis into the U.S. military establishment, develop a space program, which was basically trying to adapt the old Nazi dream. So, so if Leary was involved in that at the end of his life, it's not a very progressive cause. And that is interesting. I didn't know about that directly.
I didn't know that. Are you saying that, Gerald, because you genuinely have a question, or because that's what happened? So follow up in the chat. I don't know what you mean by that. But the other one is, how was Leary connected to Esalen? Do you have any answer to that?
That I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know everything about Leary. There are probably things I don't know that may be even worse. So some may.
I do know that these guys were all on this tour. So he was friends with what was his name? Oh no, I'm forgetting it. Who's that author who wrote with Leary? Anyway, these guys would all go on a tour and circle around Esalen. So Esalen was definitely on the kind of new.
Dick Alpert, you mean his sidekick, Dick Alpert?
Oh, that guy too. But they all would kind of go to this. Esalen was like their, if you go on a Hajj or something, it's like a new age place. You go to. It's beautiful. It's an amazing piece of property. It's literally in Big Sur, like on an outcropping over the ocean. It's really incredible. But I know all these guys would go there, speaking tours. They get paid. All that other stuff. Robert Anton Wilson would do that too. And he was in Santa Cruz at the time. He co-wrote stuff with Leary, like he was close friends with him. Guy was a full-on occultist too. But so I know that Esalen with those guys, you'll find that almost every Lily and all these other characters that I showed in that video would show up there. So that's definitely it. Let's see if I can follow up on the chat. Does anybody have any other questions? Just let me know. I know you've done a lot of other work, Jeremy, and 6 books, and you have one on the horizon. Do you mind, like, what you telling the audience what you've been working on at CoverrtAction Magazine, where people can find it, where people can support it, and and then your other kind of book projects and what you've been working on.
Sure, yeah. Well, Covert Action Magazine was founded in the late 70s by CIA whistleblower Philip Agee, who wrote Inside the Company, a CIA diary. And the magazine, yeah, has been around since that time and investigates, like the topic we're discussing today. I guess it's investigate the so-called deep state and, tries to expose CIA operations and looks at the political economic. Some of the articles, not all the articles are about the CIA. Some deal more broadly with U.S. foreign policy and the political economic dimension and how big business often drives foreign policy. And that's something Agee pointed out in his critique of the CIA. He looked at how the CIA really did the dirty work for the capitalist ruling elite and big corporations who are behind a lot of the dirty deeds of the CIA. So we look at that, how big business often drives foreign policy. And yeah, somebody pointed out the conditioning that goes on in propaganda, that's left out of so many media accounts. How a lot of the ugly thing we see going on today are driven by big business interests. And even alternative media often suppresses that, as well as the CIA role in hidden and covert operation, including on American soil. And that's something we cover sometime, like this article on the NED that's forthcoming, just one example of how the CIA is involved domestically. I mean, it's actually against the CIA charter to be involved in domestic politics, but they very much are. And they set up front groups like NED, and they infiltrate American universities. It's just one way how they're manipulating political life in the United States. So those are the kind of topic we try and research. And yeah, we're open to contributions. A lot of the listeners have knowledge on certain topics. It'd be great if you can write articles about that. I'd be happy to work with you. So yeah, you can contact me. My email is jkuzmarov2@gmail.com. And yeah, one series I developed for Covert Action that I'm publishing into a book this year was on political assassinations. And yeah, Mae Brussel, I think, was very important in investigating a lot of assassinations. And the book looks at a wide pattern, not just one assassination, but the wide pattern, and also the cover up. There's kind of a formula of cover up, including blaming the patsy, and control of the media is a very important educational system to identify independent researchers, investigators, conspiracy theorists, and try and smear and defame them. So journalists and academic and historians play a role in supporting deep state cover-ups. And overall, I think my book aimed to show, kind of puncture the myth of American exceptionalism, that we have this pure democracy compared to other countries, when really we have power intrigues and coups and political assassinations, just like other countries. And it kind of debunks the narrative of also of U.S. foreign policy, that we have this right to go spread a democracy when we really don't have a model democracy ourselves.
Good point. And she was really maybe one of the earliest, if not earliest, parapolitical researchers. So she was willing to, just ask questions and stuff like that. If I remember, she was supported by John Lennon too, like financially supported. And I mean, it's back in the day, pre-internet, guys. This is like you had to go on radio. There were only certain places where you could get this kind of information out. Like, people take it for granted that we could have this discussion right now, but back then you had to publish in like Playboy or like other skin mags or underground pamphlets and shortwave radio, like because big radio stations wouldn't take these questions either. It was all under control. So she was really the first one, and I talked to her archivist, and she has hundreds of hours, thousands of hours really of her research and stuff like that. I think it stands the test of time. She got a lot of stuff right.
Yeah, and I dedicate the book to her, and
Oh,
to
wow.
Peter Dale Scott was another. And he's still alive. He's in his 90s. He was an English professor at UC Berkeley, and he'd done a lot of great research into so-called deep politics. I think he's credited with coining that term, deep politics and the deep state.
When I was at Berkeley, I used to walk by him going through Sailor Gate. Like even back then, there was a funny, like at the very beginning of the internet, there was this site called Deep Politics. It looked super cheesy in today's context because technology has improved so much. But he was around. I still remember, and I should reach out back to him. But I was interested in. I was willing to read alternate stuff even back then, and when I was in my 20s. But because it was turned out to be more accurate than what the history or the stuff in the media really was. But
Yeah, often exactly. It's the more dissident who are the ones really kind of probing beneath the surface and uncovering the real truth, and then years later, more information comes to light, often to validate. Like Mae Brusselack with the Symbionese Liberation Army, she was onto that right away because I did a review of that Schreiber book and an article for Covert Action, and so I read some of her articles written right at that time, and nobody else was writing about that. You wouldn't find that anyone else, but she was on right away how this was a CIA operation. She had a lot of good information. And then, years later, Schreiber publishes this book, which was really well researched and just added more layers of detail. But she highlighted that right away, and nobody else. If you read even the, so Left Wing or Nation magazine, you're not going to find what Brussels was writing. So those are really
it's
the visionaries. Yeah.
it's such an important thing because it shows how sinister and how things can be infiltrated and manipulated, and how they're magnifying it through the national media, these stories. And I think it's like psyop after psyop after psyop. It seems like just like the public is just being bombarded with things just are manipulated or turned or not true, or social
Yeah.
movements that are fake,
Oh, yeah.
online stuff. And now that AI, they can probably just auto generate it. They don't have to even get an operative anymore. They just have it done through a computer, which is even more scary.
And even like they still keep coming out with movies on Jonestown that promote this official false narrative. Like I saw one on Netflix, uh, and just as an example, even stuff we're talking about today, historical stuff, even if it happened 40, 50 years ago, they're still pushing this false story today as part of these cover-ups. And it's the same like with the JFK assassination. It's been so many years, but there was if you read the New York Times, there was when Trump released some new documents, which really had nothing to do with the JFK assassination. You had this Harvard historian was featured prominently in New York Times article. Oh, this proves Oswald was a lone person. There's no evidence of these conspiracies. Yet these documents had actually nothing to do. It was all really a PR stunt, I think, by Trump to show that make it seem like he was confronting the deep state, which is, I think, part of the fraud of Trump. So, just example, even to reinforce what you're saying, even these historical topic, they're still covering it up and pushing these false narratives. And with Cord Meyer, we mentioned him. I think actually Mary Meyer said this, or Cord Meyer had said, like he bragged, he's like, we infiltrate all the radical groups, and all the campus radical academic groups were created by the CIA. Cord Meyer said that. So like all these, you have to be suspicious of groups that present themselves as radical, but they're often creation of the CIA, and they have a certain purpose to either divert the left into something that's unproductive, or to cover up some bigger thing they don't want revealed. So,
And it can end up you can end up in jail or worse. Like you guys really have to be watch out for groups like that kind of
yeah.
radical stuff,
Well, that's the other
especially.
thing. They manipulate people to do violent acts, so they look bad before the public, and they get youth arrested. That's one technique. Yeah, there are various techniques they use, and that's one of them.
Yeah, you have to be careful. Jeremy Kuzmarov, again, your email is that's JK, your last name. It's let me see, I have it right here. I want to make sure I get it right. JKUZMAROV2 at gmail.com. You can check that out. And then also Covert Action Magazine. I'll put a link there. It's Covert Action Magazine, all one word. I've had other guests on my show who write for them, Kit Clarenberg. You can see John Kiriakou. I think he's on the governing board. You've got some other guys in the alternate media. who help out at the magazine as well. Is there anything else you'd like to add, or anything I missed before we wrap it up?
No, that's good. You can also check my Substack, Too Hot for the Mainstream, as a Substack I set up.
I'll put a link to that as well. So I'll put a link to the magazine and your email and the Substack. And we had close to a couple hundred live listeners in the chat. Thanks everybody for the chat and all the questions, and thanks for showing up, and really appreciate it. And again, it's Jeremy Kuzmarov. We talked about this Leary article. Let me see if I can bring up the thing. I do have that video too. This is the video that we watched if people showed up late. I'll try to repost this on my Patreon. It is interesting, and it has subtitles, so you can check that out. But also take a look for his new book, Political Assassinations in America, The Intricate Nexus of Deep State Crime. Very important stuff. And then the Timothy Leary article that was kind of like how we started off today. And that full title of that article, I'll put a link to that as well. But it is Timothy Leary, 1960s Acid Guru, may have been among the CIA's greatest assets, and it's Jeremy Kuzmarov. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Great discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Agreed. I agree with that. All right, stay there.